I now would like to introduce Ambassador Mary Thurston of New Zealand. She officially is the Charge d'Affaires, which means in our country, once you're ambassador for life. You're still ambassador, so I call you Ambassador Thurston. Ambassador Thurston is the head of the New Zealand Embassy for an interim period. She was educated like Ambassador Gooding at Oxford in English and modern languages, French in this case. She worked in the secondary education in the UK for some years before joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Ambassador Thurston was New Zealand Ambassador High Commissioner to Poland, but accredited to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine. So she's here to tell us a little bit about her experience. Until recently, you were ambassador in Poland and looking after Ukraine within your portfolio. And more importantly, I thought, like Thailand, like a lot of countries, you mentioned the international order. The rules-based international order benefits everyone, but it benefits the small countries the most. So New Zealand is a small country, and it's far away from the war, but it is very active and vocal in voicing support for the rules-based international order, the UN Charter, international law, which has been blatantly violated. So from your point of view as a New Zealand representative, envoy, this is really undermining the rules-based world order, isn't it? And from your experience as ambassador accredited to Ukraine, any of this surprises you? And what might come next?
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, sawatika, greetings to you all. Thank you, Dr. Titinan, for the invitation to join this very esteemed panel today. I would, like other colleagues, first like to acknowledge the brave and steadfast people and government of Ukraine who are so valiantly defending themselves and in doing so defending all of us at the moment. You're right, I was New Zealand's ambassador to Ukraine for 4 years. I finished at the end of August last year. So just 6 months ago, I stood on the Maidan in Kiev, in Ukraine, as Ukraine celebrated 30 years of modern independence. There were big crowds, there was a parade, there was a flypast, foreign dignitaries, all the usual things that you see at those kinds of celebrations. And there was a real sense of optimism for the future. You could feel it as you walked around the city in Kiev, and it was something that I perhaps wasn't familiar with from previous visits. But there was a definite something in the air, a real buzz, which was good to see. There was this sense of optimism for the future, even though they knew that future probably would continue to hold challenges. After all, there's been a war in Crimea and Donbass for the last 8 years. In fact, this week, I think it's 8 years exactly since the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. President Zelensky spoke, of course, as the president, and spoke of a young country with a 1,000-year history. He spoke of the Ukrainian people and their love of that country. And now, 6 months later, we can see how this love of country has translated into defiance, resistance, and above all, courage in the face of the Russian invasion and its ongoing consequences. But you've asked a key question, and I think also Ambassador Dubanyovsky alluded to it. What does this have to do with New Zealand? It's more than 17,000 kilometres between Wellington and Kiev. That's roughly halfway around the world. Why would 5 million Kiwis, of whom only about 1,300 have Ukrainian heritage, why would we pay attention to what's unfolding in Ukraine at the moment? Well, I'd say 3 things, really. The first is that it's in our natural character to care about these things. We have a sense of fairness and decency. We have a keenly developed sense of what might be right and wrong. And values inform our approach, and we aim to be consistent in those values. It's not the first time that we've taken positions, taken stands on issues which have impacted the whole world. And I think particularly back to the First and the Second World Wars, where thousands, tens of thousands of young New Zealanders went halfway around the world to defend the situation that was happening in Europe, and then ultimately in the Second War in the Pacific, and further north in the Pacific. And even back in that time, we welcomed a group of Polish refugees to New Zealand at the end of the war, Polish children who had nowhere else to go and needed a safe place to spend a few years. Nobody knew how long, but they were made welcome in New Zealand. That was New Zealand's first group of refugees, and they've been the foundation of the Polish community in New Zealand, and it's a story that's never been forgotten. Secondly, and I think this applies to all of us, there are economic consequences. Commodity prices, people have talked about food and fuel, the effect on global markets. All of these things have ripple effects, so we're not isolated from these kinds of situations. And finally, we're a small state, and as Professor Titinan has said, we're beneficiaries of a rules-based international orders, disproportionately perhaps, but that order creates space and opportunity for our voice and our views to be heard. We need the multilateral system to be functional and effective. We have a vested interest in its success, or we risk being silenced or strong-armed. And as Burhan Ghafoor, Singapore's United Nations permanent representative, put it last week in his country's statement to the United Nations General Assembly ahead of the vote, at which 141 countries expressed their concern at the aggression against Ukraine. This issue, what's happening now in Ukraine, is a matter of principle for all small states and a matter of fundamental importance for all members of the General Assembly. In other words, we're all in this together, whether we're big or small. If one's attacked, we're all threatened. So we need to stand up for the multilateral system, international law, the UN Charter, and when a P5 member violates the UN Charter and uses the privilege of the United Nations Security Council veto to avoid sanctions, we're obliged to do all we can to protest that. But you might ask, what can a country like New Zealand do? What could we do that would be meaningful? Well, I believe we can take a position, we can use our voice, and we can take actions which show solidarity based on values and consistency, all of which are features of the international rules-based order. And by ourselves, it might not mean much, but together we can amplify these key messages, add moral weight to collective efforts, and all of the things that my colleagues have referred to are the sorts of things that New Zealand is thinking about doing. But certainly we cannot do nothing. And what have we done? We've taken a position. Aotearoa New Zealand condemns unequivocally the unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russia on Ukraine. We've used our voice. We've spoken out in the United Nations General Assembly, at the Human Rights Council, in multiple statements, in our parliament, with international partners. We've talked to people wherever we can get an audience that will hear us. And we've taken action, humanitarian support, an initial contribution of funds to support people in Ukraine, and considering further support. We've changed our immigration settings, which, if you've paid any attention to those in the last 2 years, you will know have been some of the tightest in the world. It's been very difficult for people to come across New Zealand's borders during the pandemic. So we have expedited visas and entry arrangements for people, Ukrainians who already have connections in New Zealand, and I think we're looking to see what else might be able to be done in that area. And for New Zealand, which doesn't have autonomous sanctions legislation, so we're not able to do anything sanctions-wise outside there being a UNSC resolution, just yesterday we've passed a specialised piece of legislation to allow sanctions against Russia. This legislation had all-party support, so that sense of unity has gone right across the New Zealand political scene, and all of the parties have come in behind this legislation, which will freeze assets, prevent the relocation of money and assets to New Zealand that might happen if people are trying to avoid sanctions elsewhere. And we're stopping super yachts, aircraft and ships from entering New Zealand. New Zealand's a popular destination for some of the people that are targeted. We've already put in place travel bans, including against some Belarusians who've been complicit in what's been happening in Ukraine. We've put export controls on Russian military and security forces so that they cannot use anything that comes from New Zealand in the actions that they are taking. And we've stopped foreign ministry consultations between our two ministries. We've joined united and coordinated measures against Russia in solidarity with Ukraine and the international community, including an international fora. And something else that New Zealand's done, and we did it, in fact, when the invasion and the annexation of Crimea took place, we've appealed to our country, to our economic entities, to companies in New Zealand, absent sanctions of another sort, to desist from backfilling gaps that might arise in selling products to Russia because others have to get out because of sanctions. So to their credit, New Zealand companies have appreciated the moral situation and have avoided profiting from the situation by backfilling where other countries have had to withdraw from the Russian market in terms of goods and services. So put simply, we stand with Ukraine. It's the right thing to do. Slava Ukraini, no rera tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko punka.